David Cameron, the British foreign minister, was asked in an interview, well, what would we do if a UK consulate was attacked?
Oh yeah, we have that clip. Let's take a look at that. Let's watch that.
Yeah, that would be
so
great.
Here's David Cameron, former English prime minister and current foreign minister. Here he is commenting on Iran's unacceptable attack on Israel. Let's take a look.
Reckless and dangerous thing for Iran to have done. And I think the whole world can see all these countries that have somehow wondered, well, what is the true nature of Iran? It's there in black and white.
What would Britain do if a hostile nation flattened one of our consulates?
By the way, sorry, I can't help but say the true nature of Iran is to give a warning and not kill civilians and target the military. I mean, that's what I'm reading from what they did. Anyway, we'll start from the beginning so everyone can hear it in all its glory.
Dangerous thing for Iran to have done. And I think the whole world can see all these countries that have somehow wondered, well, what is the true nature of Iran? It's there in black and white.
What would Britain do if a hostile nation flattened one of our consulates?
Well, we would take the very strong action.
And Iran would say that that's what they did?
Well, what they did, as I said, was a massive attack.
So they were right to respond, but they overreacted, is that what you're saying?
What I'm saying is that the attack they carried out was on a very large scale, much bigger than people accepted.
They have a right to respond?
Well, countries have a right to respond when they feel they've suffered an aggression. Of course they do. But look at the scale of that response. Had those weapons not been shot down,
but they just overreacted.
There could have been thousands of casualties, including civilian casualties. I think that's a really important point to take into account.
Wow.
Okay, so this was the point I wanted to bring up because Miller said the same thing. He said there could have been casualties, and so what you're seeing is a stronger condemnation and response from leaders like Miller or from spokespeople like Miller and Cameron about the potential for casualties that didn't happen. The attack is over. It didn't happen. Okay? I love it because Miller always says, I can't respond to hypotheticals when people ask him things. He'll always say that. He's like, I'm not going to respond to a hypothetical. Well, hypothetically, that didn't happen. But you're putting a hypothetical in the past, not even the future, and saying that, but look at what could have happened. While thousands of people have been killed, tens of thousands of people have actually been killed. It's not a potential. We already know they've been killed. And they don't have not even a similar response. The only way to explain that is they do not think Palestinian lives matter in any way. Palestinians are not human beings to these people. Because how do you explain how it is a bigger deal for people to possibly have died that didn't die than the people who have actually died, who've actually been killed? So it's such bizarre language. And then the other thing is this shows the nature of Iran. That's entirely racist, right? What does that mean? It shows the nature of who? The entire country? The entire 80 million people who aren't even represented by the government that they have? So what does the last 6 months show about the nature of Israel?
Yeah, which has a lot more of consensus than Iran does. I mean, in terms of what you this is your area of expertise, which I'll ask you about. But in terms of diversity of opinion, right? There are a lot of Israelis who think that Netanyahu is not using enough force. Mm-hmm. I mean, that's the range of opinion. Besides an extremely, extremely small minority, which get locked up, like we saw in Israel, where a high school teacher posted something on Facebook somewhat sympathetic to Palestinians and then was locked up. But there's no diversity of thought, substantial diversity of thought, whereas there is in Iran.
Absolutely. Yeah. If anything in Iran, that sentiment would be reversed because you would see a lot of people who take issue, a majority that actually take issue with the government. The government is not representative of them. So the fact that someone like David Cameron would make that comment, when you use language like that, when you see it's the nature, you're saying it's the nature of a people. And it's unjustified, especially in a state where those people are not represented by the authorities that are making decisions for them.
It's also funny because, again, what did they do? What is the nature? That they sent a warning, unlike Israel? That they targeted a military target, unlike Israel?
No, you could absolutely, in terms of the specific reference that he's making, that is also a really odd way of framing it, because it's like, well, what exactly is the nature of what you're talking about? They're responding to having been attacked with, you just said you would do too. Your nation state would do the same thing.
Right.
And they telegraphed their response days in advance. They were willing not to respond at all if there was simply a verbal condemnation by an international institution. So all of it, when you put it together, it's just it's mind-blowing.
It really seems to be it's like the nerve of a country, of a government, to respond, to do anything. Like that's what's unacceptable. Like, how dare they do anything and not just accept Israel's attacks and killings?
That's absolutely what it is, right? The idea is that Israel wants to have the right, and the US and much of the Western world thinks that this is justified, that Israel should have the right essentially to conduct itself however it chooses, however it wants, and it is allowed to do so, and no one is allowed to respond. That's what we were saying earlier. There's no self-defense to anything that Israel does. Israel's 100% correct. It always has the right to self-defense. No one else has the right to self-defense. They are always in the wrong. And that dichotomy is honestly insane if you think about it. If you think about it in any other situation, when would we accept that kind of absolutism in the way that we describe interactions between human beings?
Assal, as someone who has written about Iran and Iranian identity, and again, just to remind viewers and listeners, your book is called The State of Resistance, Politics, Culture, and Identity in Modern Iran. What kind of context can you provide, or what understanding do you think is often omitted of Iranian history and society?
Well, that's a huge question.
I know.
So I will say one of the things that is often omitted in the narrative, there's a few things. One of the major things is the history sort of starts with the revolution of 1979 from the US perspective. Whereas obviously this is a country with a vast, like multi-thousand-year history. But in terms of its contemporary and modern state, the 1953 coup that the US carried out, that the CIA along with the British carried out to remove the prime minister, Mossadegh, who had nationalized Iranian oil, who had helped to galvanize this democratization movement in the country in order to reimpose a dictator and a monarch who then turned around and repressed politically the Iranian system. Well, those are the roots that led to things like the 1979 revolution. Like how that history takes shape is based on these actions, foreign imposed in this case, specifically by the US in 1953. And that's really left out of the narrative. I always say one of the things that really informs the American psyche about Iran is the 1979 embassy seizure, right? The hostage crisis. This is something that paints a picture of what Iran is. And yet most people who think that are not aware of the fact that one of the roots of why that happens is also the 1953 coup, right? The Iranian Revolution happens in February of 1979. The embassy is seized in November of 1979. This is 9 months apart. What happens 2 weeks before November 4th is that the Shah is allowed to enter the United States. And so one of the factors that pushed the students who seized the embassy to do so was the fear that there would be another coup, that the Shah would be reimposed again. So there are these histories and mutual grievances that are completely missing within the narrative. And then in its contemporary form, I think there's just this attempt to sort of paint the entire country with one brush, as if 85 million people all agree on something. That is certainly not the case. There is a lot of diversity, religious, ethnic diversity, as well as political diversity within the country. And so I'm always weary of any individual or group who tries to speak on behalf of an entire population, because that's just not the case, just like it wouldn't be in any country, right? If one group tried to speak on behalf of all Americans, it would be misleading, because it would certainly be leaving out a lot of diverse voices within the country, no matter what that group is. And so I would just suggest that we treat all states with the same, all nations with the same critical thinking, that this is a diverse group of people. They don't all agree, and they don't all think the same way.